before you get started again, my name is Alex Gorman. I'm the conference coordinator of the Western Montana Breast Cancer Conference. And I'd like to welcome everybody back from lunch and those of you who were here this morning welcome you to the conference. I'm really pleased to see the great turnout today. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Deborah Davis. Dr. Davis comes to us from the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., where she is the director of the Health, Environment, and Development Program. She is also currently appointed to the National Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. Prior to that, Dr. Davis also served as the Senior Health Policy Advisor at the Environmental Protection Agency and a Senior Scientist at the Strang Cornell Cancer Prevention Center. In July of 1997, Dr. Davis was a keynote speaker at the World Conference on Breast Cancer in Kingston, Ontario, speaking on the effects of persistent organic pollutants and pesticides. And more recently, last May, she was selected by the Smithsonian Institution to deliver a distinguished lecture on invention and innovation for the environment, in which she highlighted issues of prevention in breast cancer. Currently, for those of you who haven't seen it, Dr. Davis is featured on the cover of Man magazine as one of the top 50 who made a difference in breast cancer in the United States. She agreed to trek all the way out to Missoula to be with us here today, and so here to speak on rethinking breast cancer in the environment, Deborah Davis.
First, I want to thank Alex and Barney and Bryony and all the people who put this meeting together. When I was asked if I'd come to Montana, I said in a heartbeat, this is God's country. And I really have not spent that much time in this wonderful state, but I'm looking forward to being able to spend more, because it really is a remarkable land. And I think that it also has a history of remarkable women. And I'm quite pleased to be now here among you, and looking forward to talking with you today about what we know about breast cancer in the environment, what we suspect about this, and what we can do in the meantime. Now, people often ask me, what's going on today? I mean, is there really something so different about breast cancer? And I say, well, you know, breast cancer has always been a pretty important problem for women. What's really so different now is women are different. It used to be 20 and 30 years ago that the diagnosis of breast cancer meant that a woman went off alone into the closet and cried silently. And literally, girls didn't know when their mother had breast cancer. It was a secret. It was a dirty secret. So there was something to be ashamed of. That's changed, and it's changed because women have changed. And there are more of us now in positions to try to do something about this disease. And there are more women in society in different positions. I mean, for example, we now have 2 women on the Supreme Court. Only 7 more to go. So I'm very happy to be here today, and I want to talk with you about some of the observations that my colleagues and I have made about the links between breast cancer and environment. But let me be very clear. It is still a puzzle. The links don't all necessarily fit together. But what I want to do in my remarks today is try to shift the public discussion to the things that you can do to reduce your risk, not just as individuals, but the things that we have to all work together in society, in government, and in the private sector to do. So I'm going to walk you through some of the evidence that we have amassed, looking at studies, recognizing that the reason we need to address this question is that although genetics has been heavily touted in the press, and is in fact legitimately a very exciting field today, fewer than 1 in 10 women who could develop breast cancer develop it because of a defect in their genes that they were born with. Let me be clear. Inheriting a defect is the cause of only 1 in 10 cases of breast cancer. Now, in fact, all cancer arises through defects in genes that emerge throughout life. But being born with a defect really only explains 1 in 10 cases. And that means that most people are born with healthy genes, and then something happens in the course of their lifetime to give them breast cancer. This is really the challenge before us today. Why do most women who get breast cancer get the disease? Most cases, in fact, occur in women with few of the known risk factors. So it's a puzzle of enormous importance for all of us. Let me put it in this proportion. This year, a little less than 50,000 women will die of breast cancer in the United States. Each one of those who dies loses nearly 20 years of life on average. This means that we lose in the United States the equivalent of 1 million woman years of life each year from this disease. We will not be able to prevent all of breast cancer, we know that. But I'm going to show you why we think we can prevent some of it. There are 3 types of evidence I'm going to discuss today. The first is experimental evidence, well-done studies, controlled studies on animals, and I know some of you here object to that, but I want to make it clear that without that research, we would not be able to develop some of the drugs that we have that do work, and we would not be able to predict harm before it happens. So we have to rely in cancer research on experimental studies. We also have evidence from wildlife. Now, wildlife is a little more problematic because not only are animals in the wild, we don't know who their parents were, we don't know what they ate, we don't know what viruses they've been exposed to, unlike the experimental studies. But we can draw lessons from wildlife. And finally, you'll see here my politically correct blue people. We have human studies. Now, human studies are the most incomplete and the most difficult to do for reasons which I will make clear in the remainder of my talk. And human evidence should never be used as hostage for environmental protection or preventive action. If we wait for proof of human harm before taking preventive action, it is too late. So what I want to talk with you about now is the animal evidence, the wildlife evidence that we have, the experimental evidence that we have, and then I will finally conclude with some of the human evidence, acknowledging that there are fundamental flaws in our ability to develop that evidence, and if we remain smart, those flaws we will allow not to interfere with the development of preventive policies. When it comes to risk factors of breast cancer, let me just ask this of the group here. How many of you have some health or medical training? All right. I will speak to those of you who do not to explain what a risk factor is, because this term is used all the time. It can be a little confusing. Risk factors are obtained by looking at the risk of breast cancer in those with elevated exposures compared to those without such exposures. And one looks at group 2 people that one can identify in terms of their exposure to, for example, whether or not they nursed their children. That turns out to be a small risk factor for breast cancer, having not nursed children. The comparison is then made between those who have exhibited this behavior and those who have not, to see whether the risk of breast cancer is greater. I want to ask, how many of you know someone with breast cancer? I'm not surprised at this group. This is a biased sample, shall we say. But I'm going to ask you, as I discuss these risk factors, I'm going to ask at the end for those of you to raise your hand if you know of a person with this risk factor. All right? And it will be an interesting exercise just among ourselves here. Risk factors, though, are not necessarily causes of breast cancer. And I want to make that clear. All that risk factors are characteristics of personal characteristics or exposure characteristics that are associated with an increased risk of disease. That's what a risk factor is. But it's not necessarily a cause. Now let's look at some of these known risk factors that have been identified. Family history of breast cancer, particularly before the age of 40, in a mother or sister, first-degree relative, is a risk factor. How many of you know someone with that risk factor? Family history before age 40 of breast cancer. 9. Early menses. Menses before age 12. How many know someone with that risk factor? Maybe Alice, I'll ask if you would jot these down and we'll see the tally, if you don't mind. Let me count the hands here for a bit. 14. Okay? Someone keep track of that until after. Late menopause. Entering menopause after age 55 is a risk factor for breast cancer. Okay? 1, 2, 3. That's 3 for late menopause. Thank you. All right. Radiation exposure. Let me define this because we're all exposed to radiation by living at altitude, among other things. diagnostic radiation exposure and as a teenager, to the diagnostic radiation exposure to the chest area, or fluoroscopic exposure without any shielding, particularly in the teenage years. How many of you know someone who had that experience? For example, my generation was treated for the disease of acne, right? You got acne treatment or scoliosis treatment with radiation. How many of you know of that? Radiation prior to age 20. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 11. Lack of exercise. That's a difficult one. That's a very difficult one. It's all relative, isn't it? But what it's referring to here is people who are extremely sedentary, really classic couch potatoes, compared to someone who gets 3 hours or more of exercise a week. And exercise, of course, the life of women is full of exercise, isn't it? All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. 30. All right. We're going to continue on here. Now, if we look at these risk factors, in fact, we can make a distinction among 3 types. There are those that are direct, that cause damage directly to the breast cells, such as radiation. And the damage is greatest when the radiation occurs in teenage years. In fact, mammographic screening in women after menopause will save lives. Mammography is not prevention, so mammography is very important, but it can't prevent the disease. A history of breast cancer is also a direct risk factor, especially if it's premenopausal in the mother or sister. And if you have either of these risk factors, your increase in breast cancer relative to someone without these risk factors is 2 to 4-fold. That's what a risk factor refers to. Now let's talk about some time-dependent risk factors. These are risk factors that extend the total amount of time during which the breast is undergoing growth and stimulation. And these are risk factors that have been identified in studies, and my colleagues and I have recently published, and I believe you have copies of the paper that we've just produced, an analysis of why some of the time-dependent risk factors may be controllable or preventable. Let's talk about what some of them are. First, it's important to realize that there are 3 different stages of vulnerability. The first is the embryonic, when the breast cells are first being laid down. The second is during adolescence, when the breast is actually developing. And of course, a developing breast is more vulnerable because rapidly growing cells are more vulnerable to injury. And the third is menopause. And I actually think I'd like to get a hiker instead of a golfer, because of course golf courses are not without risk themselves. But this is what menopause looks like nowadays. And certainly this is more of what it looks like than in the past. But the point is that vulnerability changes at these different stages of life. And what these factors are things that affect breast cell growth. So early stimulation, embryonic, or stimulation during adolescence, or even post-menopause can increase breast growth. Elevated prenatal hormones in twin girls who are a twin with a boy twin. How many of you have had twins or know someone with twins? You are a twin. Oh, you are a twin. Interesting. And you have a twin brother. Well, twin girls who have a twin brother, their mothers, when the girl was prenatal, had circulating amounts of everything that was more, because a pregnant woman who has twins has more of everything. And one of the theories is that they would have had elevated prenatal exposure to hormones, which would put the breast at an increased risk when it later on got exposed to some of the things I'm going to talk about. So there is evidence of this from twins, and there's also evidence that mothers who are toxemic, which gives you low hormones, their girls have lower risk of breast cancer. So there's very interesting evidence in the prenatal world. But this is not fated. This is simply a risk factor. Having had no children, how many of you know someone who has had no children? As a risk factor for breast cancer. As a risk factor for breast cancer. A person with breast cancer with no children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 22. Oh, I'm sorry. And 3 more, right? Is it 3? And that's 25. Okay. Never having nursed a child. All right, 1, 2, 3. Well, it will be the same group in a sense, right? But, well, that will be 23 plus maybe 1 or 2 others. Any that didn't have their hands up before? An additional hand for never nursing. So it would be 27. Late menopause. We already did that one. Now there are some others. Menses, never having nursed. Being over age 65 is a risk factor. All right? Being an older woman is a risk factor. Anyone know breast cancer in someone over 65? First diagnosed, over 65. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20, 21, 2, 3, 4, 5, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. Okay? Contributing risk factors are those that alter the hormonal environment. Those are things that can change the ratio of good to bad estrogens, and I'll talk to you later about what good and bad estrogens are, because not all estrogens are bad. Those are things that can accelerate breast cancer growth, and I'm going to show you what some of them are. These things include alcohol. Consuming on a daily basis, yes, it would be 2 drinks a day of wine or beer, is a risk factor for breast cancer. How many of you know women who have consumed that much alcohol as adults? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Lack of exercise, we already did. Lack of fiber and vitamin D is a question. You know, if you had a very, very low fiber diet and not a lot of vitamin D. That would probably be a difficult thing to know about, but anyone here feels that they have that information about someone who has breast cancer? Right. Obesity after menopause is a risk factor for breast cancer. Any cases in women who are obese, defined as 25% over what you think that the charts would say you should weigh? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, okay, 14. Now, in addition, there are some other contributing risk factors. Living near a chemical facility has been identified as a risk factor. Living within a mile of a chemical plant is a risk factor, according to a New York State study. How many of you have that experience? Yes. I suppose that one could say that, although that is being studied right now, but I think in living in an area with intensive chemical use, certainly. Yes, all right. So let me ask how many of you fit that criteria here. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, is that a hand? 15, okay. Lifetime exposure to harmful xenohormones, you won't know this because who knows what a harmful xenohormone is? It comes from the word, thank you, it comes from the Greek term xeno meaning foreign and hormone meaning hormones. But a recent study has found that elevated amounts of growth factor in women prior to menopause increase their risk of breast cancer. Now, where does elevated amounts of growth factor come from? I think, unfortunately, it comes from such things as having diabetes. Does anyone know someone with diabetes who has breast cancer? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll put 7 down for that. But it also comes from something else I'm going to show you in just a moment. The point is that most of the risk factors we've just gone over are linked by one thing. Accepting radiation, they're all linked to a greater amount of circulating hormones in the body. If a woman exercises regularly, she has lower amounts of hormone, and that's one reason, by the way, why Olympic athlete women tend to be have very, very few periods. They become literally amenorrheic because if you exercise a lot, your total amount of hormones is down. If you drink less alcohol. Alcohol itself is estrogenic. So alcohol works by promoting hormones. But if you drink and you exercise, then you have a bit of a balance. So you see, no, there is no simple answer here. There is no simple answer here. But the real challenge to all of us is, how do we work to reduce the burden of this disease on all of us? And I think one way we do that is become better informed about these different factors. If you look at such things as early menses, the earlier in life a girl gets her period, and the later in life a woman enters menopause, the more hormones she can be exposed to throughout her life. And if she has no children, and if she lives near a chemical plant, then her risk is going to be greater, according to the work that we will be talking about here today. The two most important risk factors, however, are sex and age. So there's something about women growing older. And in fact, I believe that was the one that had the most categories, was over 65. Right, all right. And the point is this. What is it about getting older for a woman that increases the risk of breast cancer? Part of it is biology. It is biology. It's the fact that we live long enough and there's cumulative exposure to hormones. Part of it, however, is environmental, in the sense that there are things in the environment that influence the amount of hormones our bodies produce. And some of those things, we've done a real good job of telling people about what they're responsible for. And you've perhaps seen that famous T-shirt, "Oh my God, I should have had children." Well, what we are working on, my colleagues and I at Strang Cornell and at Beth Israel Hospital in New York, are the things that women can do something about with society and with our homes and our families and our communities and our businesses and the government. These are the things I want to talk about in the remainder of my talk today. When we look at the breast is primarily fat. And in fact, it's really important for you to know this. Clinical breast exam is a very important thing for every woman to undergo. A thorough physical exam is very important. You check out those breasts back there that you can feel. I wouldn't mind if my breasts felt like that. They haven't for years. But the fact of the matter is, if you work well with a clinician who knows your breast, that's very important to provide for detection of breast cancer, although again, even early detection is not prevention. How many of you have had a thorough clinical breast exam? And how many of those exams have taken more than 4 minutes? Good. The rest of you go back. A good clinical breast exam starts with you standing, leaning forward, and it takes a long enough time that you wonder whether the person doing it is enjoying themselves. And I would really urge you all to check out the models that are back there in the back of the room to see just how difficult it is, even in models where you know, where it tells you there's a lump, to pick them up. But while it's important for women to be familiar with their breasts and to participate in self-exam, unfortunately, it doesn't protect you against getting the disease. And what we want to talk about now are things we know that will reduce the risk of the disease. Now, I said that there are good and bad hormones or estrogens. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. The estrogen receptor is like a lock with a key on it. It is turned on and binds with the estrogen receptor. It fits in with it. And when it does that, it can cause harmful cell growth. And those harmful cells can become cancerous. Now, good estrogens are things such as those in soy products and broccoli and olive oil, possibly garlic, flaxseed, and other materials that stimulate antioxidants, and they tend to reduce aberrant cell growth. And they also bind with the estrogen receptor, so that's why you can get these people who, for a variety of reasons, want to confuse us all and say, well, there are more natural estrogens out there and they're swamped by all of the synthetic ones, so we shouldn't pay any attention to these synthetic estrogens, such as those in some plastics and fuels. But in fact, the good estrogens also bind with the receptor, but they tend to be rapidly excreted, and they tend to cause less harmful cell growth and, in fact, repair. Harmful xenohormones, for those of you who are interested in the metabolites of it, tend to promote the development of something called 16-alpha-hydroxyestrone, and genetic damage can occur from them, or they can work through the estrogen receptor. So there are two different paths here. One path goes through hormones, one path goes through genes. But the bottom line is, either path can lead to breast cancer. And this has been elaborated by my colleagues and I in the monograph that is available for those of you who are interested in a more technical understanding of it. Yes, ma'am?
You're saying that one goes to estrogen, so that would be like an estrogen receptor positive?
No, actually, estrogen receptor positive and or negative is the status of the tumor that is determined after diagnosis of breast cancer has been made. Okay? And it's not, the binding of the estrogen receptor occurs whether or not you have breast cancer. We have estrogen receptors in all of our organs, really, our brain, our liver, our ovaries, and our breast. And these harmful xenoestrogens can bind with the estrogen receptor and rev it up and turn it on to cause cell growth, while the beneficial ones can bind with the estrogen receptor and prevent aberrant cell growth.
That would happen in
It would not tend to happen in a woman who's estrogen receptor negative. But that's an issue that we are still doing research on. I just want to show you a little bit here about what goes on with tumor development. You see here on the left that yellow cell is already altered genetically, but all of us have mutations all the time. And we get repaired all the time, or we wouldn't be here. What happens is the process of hyperplasia develops. You see the slightly thicker cells around, and then it leads to dysplasia. And ultimately, where the blue works in, you start to get the development of an in situ cancer, and it becomes invasive and finally can move into the bloodstream. And that is what we need to prevent. And that is, but once it has happened, there are ways to reduce the rate of recurrence as well. And now I want to talk with you about some of the experimental evidence that has been amassed on this. We know that a number of these compounds can produce breast tumors in male rats. That's not a good thing, because male rats aren't even supposed to have breasts or mammary glands. And these compounds include benzene, which is in, of course, gasoline, although in lower amounts nowadays, some pesticides, and some such as atrazine. And atrazine is a very interesting pesticide because it's one of the highest used pesticides on corn and wheat. And it causes breast tumors, mammary tumors in male animals. Vinyl chloride is another one. Vinyl chloride is produced itself as a monomer. It's used to make polyvinyl chloride plastics. And I have been told that it is burned here in Missoula in the cardboard manufacturing facility. So vinyl chloride is a very interesting compound because it has been known to be hazardous for quite some time. And worldwide there are efforts to prevent and prohibit its use in, for example, Denmark and Sweden, and a number of other countries are trying to reduce the use. It has been banned in most workplaces, but polyvinyl chloride is currently in high use in a number of places, and there's a very active discussion about alternatives to this. Now, this is an example of what happens if you take a petri dish and you put breast cancer cells in that dish. You see their bar on the 0 bar right there? Richard, can you see that? You see what happens with nothing in it at all, 0, with breast cancer cells. If you add 50 micrograms, 75 or 100 micrograms to this petri dish, look what happens to those breast cancer cells. Now, you don't want breast cancer cells to grow more than they're already growing, and this clearly shows you can accelerate their growth with DDT. The same thing occurs with red dye number 3, which is a currently legal dye that is used in rather cheap cosmetics and foods. Red dye number 3 accelerates the growth of breast cancer cells in a petri dish. Now, these are cells in a petri dish, but they're human breast cancer cells. And this is experimental evidence. So you might say, well, what does it do to humans? And the answer is, I don't want to wait to find out. That's my answer. That is what I'm going to end talking to you about, what policies we need to pursue in the meantime. This is a very interesting picture here. This shows you what happens with normal, healthy breast cells when they're communicating. Now, just like in families, people have to communicate, and with teenagers, people have to communicate. If you have good communication, your cells are anchored, right? And they communicate, and you see this healthy yellow stain here. But if you add a little bit of DDT, look what happens. The cells lose their anchors. They become anchorage independent. And just like boats and families, you need an anchor. Without an anchor, the cells can grow out of control. And this is an example of what can happen. This is with a mixture of pesticides as well. So we know that you can disturb normal cell communication with exposure to environmental materials in laboratory studies. Now, laboratory studies have also given us some of the good news in the work that we can do now on breast cancer. We know that there are vegetable products such as soy, exercise, fish and olive oil, and a high-fiber diet. All of these have been shown to be protective. I'm going to explain why, I think, in a moment. All of these protective factors are linked by lowering your lifetime exposure to unbound hormones. If you have a high-fiber diet, you have a higher throughput, you have less fecal mutagens and hormones, and you literally excrete them faster so that you have more protection against breast cancer. Soy products work to reduce the circulating amounts of harmful hormones. Exercise also lowers these levels. A high-fiber diet works in that way as well. And fish oil reduces the growth of breast cancer cells. Broccoli, actually a product in broccoli called indole-3 carbinol, also reduces the growth of breast cancer cells. So these are some of the things that we know can reduce the risk in people even once you've had the disease. Now, I wanted to show you this beautiful picture here. Any of you biochemists? Well, you never know. Right, nowadays especially. But you see where you've got all that really, the pretty purple stuff there is bad for you. Okay? The pretty purple stuff indicates it's very lipid soluble. And these are the compounds that tend to bind with the estrogen receptor and rev it up. The things that have more of the turquoise and the red are more water soluble. And these are the things that tend to be more rapidly excreted, such as on the bottom here, soy products and some of the plant estrogens. So we have here a very beautiful abstract picture that shows you that there are some very subtle biochemical characteristics of the compounds that we believe are going to increase the risk of breast cancer, that distinguish them from the compounds that will reduce the risk. And this is pioneering research being conducted now at the University of Pittsburgh that will allow us ultimately to figure out which things we ought to reduce our uses of in the environment. Now I'm going to talk about wildlife evidence. And obviously we are not birds and alligators and fish and ducks and turtles, but we have the same basic building blocks of life, DNA. And one of the most impressive findings recently, and how many of you have heard about the Lake Apopka alligators in Florida? Right? This was one of the largest freshwater lakes in Florida, near Disney World. And a massive spill occurred in this lake of a pesticide called dicafol in 1980s. And that pesticide legally contained 20% DDT as an inert ingredient. Because one of the wonderful things that the Reagan administration did was to slow up the regulation of pesticides, and it wasn't really until the late 80s that we got a more active regulation of inert ingredients. Remember that some of the people in the Reagan administration went to jail for their jobs. Unusual dedication to service. While they were working, one of the things that happened in this lake in Florida was that there were 12-feet alligators that were developing very serious problems. First of all, most of the alligators in the lake appeared to be female, and the males had a kind of unusual problem. They tended to have small penises, which is a very big problem if you're an alligator. This is an example of a penis on a 12-foot alligator. And I want to say that this finding on the alligators was matched by findings that the hormone levels, even in the females they had, or skewed, so that they had too much female hormones in the female and too much female hormones in the males. Now, alligators live in the mud, and although the water of the lake was clean by EPA standards, and it was clean, the mud wasn't, because the mud contained all the sediments, and that's where the alligators lived, and that's where their eggs hatched. So we're not alligators, fortunately, but we need to pay attention to what happened to them in this situation. Now I want to show you some of the human studies. Now, until 1994, the studies on humans and breast cancer and DVT were mixed. And I'm not going to go into great detail except to say that each one of these bars represents a different study. And they did tend to find that with higher exposure to DVT, there was a risk of breast cancer. But more recent studies have not necessarily found this. This one study here showed a 7-fold increased risk for women who had higher levels of growth factor, but no risk for DVT. Now, what's wrong with this picture? I think it's important that you realize two things. First of all, human studies are limited because we have to examine the things that live for 30 years in the body. If somebody asked you how many pesticides you were exposed to in your lifetime, you wouldn't really know. None of us would know. We wouldn't know about those flea dips or the sprays in the garden or what was put on the wheat. We wouldn't have information about it. So the things we can measure in humans now are the things that are attracted to fat, like the DDT compounds and the organofluorines. All of the studies that have been negative have measured the DDT materials, but have not asked questions about exercise and fish oil and broccoli and soy and other things. So as a consequence, the most recent studies that have been done on this, that have looked at women after they have the disease, it's very important. You have the disease and you're compared to someone who doesn't have the disease. You're forced to ask, well, what's left in your body now? And the question is the difference in the levels that we find now really a cause of the disease or a consequence of the disease? And that's not a question we're going to be able to answer in my lifetime. The way we'll answer that question is to do studies of women for 50 years and follow them throughout their lives. No one has ever done that yet. As a consequence, though, there's a lot of confusion on this issue because, in fact, the studies aren't definitive. I want to be clear about that. There is not definitive proof in humans that these materials cause breast cancer. But as far as I'm concerned, the evidence in the cell cultures I've shown you, the evidence of the structures of the chemicals, and the evidence in the wildlife provide a compelling weight of evidence for why we should take precautionary action. And I'm going to turn to that in a moment. One of the things I'm often asked is, well, is this just about women? And the answer is no. And I'm really pleased to see a number of non-women here today. Testicular cancer is increasing in men in every industrial country. We don't know why. Hypospadia, which is defects of the penis of baby boys, is also increased in the United States and in most countries where we've looked. Defects of the testes have increased, and infertility is reported to have increased. Now, you've heard about the sperm count issue because it tends to get a lot of attention. A fall in sperm count is reported, but the fall is apparently greater in Los Angeles and not in New York, and it's a very sticky problem to study. So what I believe we can talk about instead is the fact that there is this puzzle of male reproductive problems that we cannot explain that could be of great importance and may well be related to the same types of endocrine disrupting materials in the environment. Let me just give you some examples here. This is what's going on in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland with respect to testicular cancer in the past 3 decades. It's a rare cancer, but it's increasing. The same trend in the United States. This is hypospadias in the United States. You see here almost nearly an 80% increase from 1970 to 1993 in defects of the penis in baby boys. Now, this is not due to improved diagnosis. This defect almost always requires surgical intervention. Now, we have recently published an analysis of the birth of baby boys relative to baby girls in the United States and Canada. In Canada, you see a much sharper decline, and I'm going to go over these briefly. For those of you who are interested, I'll be glad to give you more information on it, but I just want you to get an idea that this is not a unique set of problems for women's health. health. This is something that we have a number of unexplained health issues for men and women. The number of boys being born relative to girls has dropped in Canada and in the United States. And it is a statistically significant drop, but it drops from a ratio of 0.515 to about 0.5135 in Canada, and from 0.513 in the United States to about 0.512. Now, those are small drops. Those are drops of 1,000th of a point. But they are statistically significant because they really represent several thousand baby boys who would have been born in the U.S. 38,000 more in the United States and nearly 9,000 more in Canada if the sex ratio had not declined.
Over how many years?
Over the past 30 years. Now, nobody can tell you why this is happening. But what we can tell you is that in some workers that have been exposed and studied, for example, exposed to certain pesticides, they have not been able to produce any baby boys. And in Seveso, Italy, there was an explosion of dioxin from a chemical plant. And in that population, which was a small population, so I want to say we have to be careful because it's a small population, of those with the highest levels of dioxin that were measured, immediately after the explosion, they drew blood from people, all right? And they stored the blood. And then 10 years later, they counted the births of the children. Not a single person in the highest level of exposure to dioxin produced a single baby boy. Small numbers, but it's still a very troubling finding. Now, there are a lot of other things that influence sex ratio, including age of parents and medical treatments. In vitro fertilization can produce more girls than boys. So we want to be careful here, but we're dealing with something as vital and vulnerable and important as reproduction of the human species. And something is going on here that we can't explain. Now, when it comes to breast cancer, we have further things we can't explain. There are areas of the country where there appear to be elevated rates of breast cancer. Now, whether the rates are really elevated, the first thing that usually happens in an area like this is the public health officials are called in and they say, well, it's not any different here than any place else. And you know what? It usually isn't. The fact of the matter is this. We don't know why most women get breast cancer. Most women who get breast cancer have very few of the known risk factors. What we have to do to reduce the burden of breast cancer really involves policy changes at many levels. We need to do clinical studies of normal hormones, because we don't know what normal is. And when women go, well, I think I'm in menopause, and they want to check their hormones, nobody really knows what a real baseline is supposed to be. We are very different from one another. We need screening methods so that we can look at new and existing materials to figure out which ones are going to be more hazardous. And we need social policies to reduce risk factors from the household and the workplace. It's not just a question of what you do for yourself. And we need to improve the use of methods to screen chemicals and to study people. Now, while we do all of this, are we supposed to throw up our hands and say, wait, we're uncertain, we better not do anything? I think not. I think that we can come up with can-do lists that will reduce the risk of breast cancer. Things that you can do, that the community can do, the government, private sector. And I want to remind you, because some people say, well, gee whiz, we're not really sure. You know, where you stand depends on where you sit. And if your goal is to prevent disease, to promote public health, then you want to err on the side of taking precautionary action. This is a cartoon from Doonesbury from a medical textbook in the 1860s that warned about the hazards of tobacco. In the 1860s, yes, that's what I said. Now, there were doctors who warned about the hazards of tobacco from the very time tobacco was first brought back by Walter Raleigh. And it was originally used by the Native Americans as a ceremonial agent. It was never used by the native peoples in the way that it became used as it was domesticated further. And there were people who warned Walter Raleigh about the hazards of tobacco. It was only when more than 50 studies had been published in 20 different countries, all consistently showing the hazards of tobacco, that action was taken. And it was only when we had enough dead bodies that action was taken to try to reduce the use of tobacco. And no one today, except for those who are still in the employment of some of the large companies that manufacture tobacco, seriously doubts that tobacco is a hazard. And yet we expect that there may be as many as 10 million avoidable deaths by the middle of the next century associated with this very bad addictive habit. So when it comes to the evidence on breast cancer and the environment and environmental health, we have to say, okay, we don't have that many studies in humans, but we have a lot of good information, a lot of good experimental information, a lot of wildlife information that we have to pay attention to. Now, it's important to realize that this problem is too big to be left to the government or the private sector, and that meetings like the one that we're having here today are absolutely critical, because the only thing that's going to lead to changing policies now will be for groups of concerned citizens to get together. Now, you know, there's a lot of interest in the world economy, and the world seems to be dominated by economics lately, but it's important to remember that the word economics comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home. And it's women in their homes all over the world that really determine social policy, that determine environmental policy, the first line front, especially in developing countries. And when it comes to health issues in this country, organizations like Women's Voices is also an example that that is the kind of group that can often lead to changing public policy. The precautionary principle is really what we have to argue for now. We will lose the debate if we get involved in the debate on the details of the science right now, because there has been a shift toward asking for proof of human harm. And we cannot offer definitive proof of human harm when it comes to these issues. And I believe we shouldn't have to, because prevention is always better than treatment. There isn't a single person here, no matter how well you're doing with breast cancer, that wouldn't rather not have had the disease. And certainly there's no one here who doesn't want her daughter or her sister to develop the disease, if we can possibly figure out how to do that. And that is why The Lancet has recently written in an editorial, we should be prepared to take action even when the scientific knowledge is not conclusive. Today's the Sabbath, and the rabbi was out of town, or I would have been able to enjoy that part of Missoula as well. But I want to share with you this thought from the Talmud. Sometimes people say, this is a very complicated problem, and you really aren't going to be able to solve it. It cuts across society. It involves changes in procurement policies. It involves changes in the very fabric of our life. It involves so many things at so many levels. It's true. And we can't do this. No one of us working on this can do this alone. It's going to require all of us starting the process, even though we can't begin it. And I want to conclude with this prayer that was first shared with me by a breast cancer veteran. She did not want to call herself a survivor. She thought it was too passive. A veteran. Yesterday is the past. Tomorrow is the future. Today is the gift. That's why we call it present. I'll put that back for a moment. And I want to thank you for having me come here, and I'd be happy to take your questions. And I want to give you our website address now, where we have some of this slideshow will be up on our website, and we're hoping to get some funds so that we can create zip files so that you can download it, so that everybody can take this with text and share it with others, so that we can create more of an informed public that can change public policy and see that breast cancer is really preventable. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. Yes.
There's a new fad, human growth hormone, as a hormone for anti-aging. I'm being bombarded with tapes weekly. What was, can you comment?
Yeah, well, human growth hormone will help things grow. And it's clear that it does do that. I'm not an expert on it, but I would be concerned that anything that makes things grow is going to make good things grow and bad things grow. And since we all contain aberrant material in us all the time, it's the balance that you want to be concerned about. And so I'm not well enough informed to give you a professional view, but I would say I'm cautious and concerned. I'm certainly very concerned about athletes using training drugs, whether it's amro, androstenedione, or creatine, because there are no studies on the long-term consequences of these things. And it may be that there are some conditions where it's merited, but I'd be very concerned about this. Yes?
Some of us really feel that Missoula might be a hotspot for breast cancer. Having discussed this with various folks in the clinical area, several of us that are having personal experiences with the disease. What's the value in your mind, since we're kind of organizing principle here, what's the value in your mind of establishing a place as a hotspot? Is that a useful technique in your perspective looking around? You didn't seem to elaborate much on it in your slideshow, so I'm thinking of you. I know Steigraber was here earlier this year. She seems to advocate, or at least often the police to do that kind of thing. So I was curious in your view of how useful that is as an outcome for public education meetings, or how difficult it is to do in your mind in a credible manner for particularly a community-based group or something like that, as opposed to say medical group.
Those are very good questions, and I thought a lot about some of them. I think it's always a good idea for women to come together because we get strength from one another when we're dealing with situations like this. But I think that this situation, where you think you may have an elevated rate, because Missoula, the population of Missoula is what, 40,000?
Actually, in the urban area here, I think we get more like 75.
Okay. Well, traditionally, rates of breast cancer are calculated as rates per 100,000. You have tremendous in-migration and out-migration and tremendous mobility of the populations. It will be very difficult to study Missoula as a hotspot. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do it. So let me separate your questions into, can it be done, should it be done, and then if so, what would you do? Right? It's very difficult to do it in a way that would be of statistical value, but it may be of great political value. As I wrote in the article that I hope you get a chance to read, whatever is going on in San Francisco, Missoula, Los Angeles, or any place else, it's very important to realize that most women who get breast cancer have very few risk factors. And so it's of great value to try to do an understanding and develop a survey of the people in your own community. The trade-off, if you do it as a group of citizens, it will be extremely difficult, not impossible, but extremely difficult to do it in a way that would be scientifically credible because of the problems of bias that enter into any study like that. We would all understand that. So that the question really, it seems to me, is I think one can already organize around the concept of preventing breast cancer, reducing environmental factors, even if Missoula didn't have any hotspot at all. Because we know enough to know that we ought to get pesticides out of our schools, we ought to reduce our uses of them in our homes and gardens, we ought to reduce our use of toxic materials around us. We need to certainly support the right to know about where emissions are coming out of factories. We already know enough to do those things. Breast cancer offers a kind of organizing tool, and people who come to the issue of breast cancer are motivated in a very profound and powerful way, which is why I'm here. But I'm not sure that setting up your own survey would be the best use of your resources. And I think in order for you all to make that decision, you need to get together and find out who you are. That is, who are those of you who care about this enough to work on these issues. And then figure out what are your options. One of the things I'm concerned about in San Francisco is that, and I'm involved as an advisor to them, they sort of made this idea of a study a high priority. And as a consequence, they may be losing opportunities to get better pollution control, shut down some very dangerous plants, improve the public right to know about things. So it's a very fine set of trade-offs there. Missoula is a small enough area that it will be difficult to get a good study out of it, even if it was done by, in fact, maybe even especially if it was done by people who are academic epidemiologists, because they don't tend to have the same passion about the issue as you will. So I'm not trying to equivocate here. I think that you all have to talk among yourselves as to what is the best use of your resources. I mean, we know enough to know that there are some things and materials in the environment now that ought not to be there, that we ought to reduce our use of these, and we ought to create incentives for the private sector to get on the train and stop emitting things that are dangerous to people, and stop asking us to prove that these things are bad for us by showing that there's human effects. And one of my concerns that comes out of the breast cancer activist community is people saying, well, let's show them what's happening. I don't want to wait. I don't have that much more time left to show you for sure what's happening. And I think what we need to do is empower communities and work with people. There are some people in the private sector now who are very concerned about this. And you've got industries here in Montana, the nutraceutical industry, for example, that's very deeply committed to this issue. And I would try to work with them on positive action to reduce exposures rather than focusing on proving that we have been damaged. That would be my own, inclination. But again, you need to talk among yourselves about what the sense is of priority. And never underestimate the power of the story of an individual. It can really be more effective than scientific study.
What about pollutants such as high carbon monoxide levels and mold and mildew?
Yeah. Well, carbon monoxide is an air pollutant. It certainly is not a good thing in terms of heart and respiratory problems. I don't know of anything linking it to breast cancer. Mold and mildew, there are a lot of very interesting molds out there. None of them that I know have been well studied for this, but I wouldn't, again, I think that these are things that have to be explored.
Well, I would think that would lower the body's resistance to have to cope with spending large amounts of I-1.
Sure, certainly could.
Well, on the other hand, you mentioned a lot of organic compounds. And you also said that the compounds that are more persistent and soluble in fat, is there a link there?
Well, yes, there's a link there, but the problem is a little bit... Right, well, the problem with focusing chlorine is a little bit like we're looking under the lamppost because the light is better there. We can see it because the half-life of DDT in the human body is 12 to 20 years. So that's why we've done all this focusing on it, but we're missing some other important things, certain plastics, polyvinyl chloride metabolites we can't find in the human body, and they may be much more important. So that's the trick. That's why it's very difficult to do this work. And we have to be aware of that at the outset. Otherwise, we're going to set up these studies that are designed to fail. And, for example, if we were to do an organochlorine blood levels of people living around that factory, well, it might be interesting, but it could also be a real problem because you would only know that. You wouldn't know what they ate. You wouldn't know what else they were exposed to. And it could be, likely would be a negative result. I would not recommend that you do that. That I can say right now. On the other hand, we know enough about exposures to say that you ought to clean some things up. Yes?
I know that you had a survey on the map in your area, and I know Nassau County had some suspicions that there were high levels of breast cancers were there. And I grew up in the New York area and spent summers in Nassau County and got breast cancer very widespread. And I was just wondering if they have found anything conclusive about that area.
Well, no, they haven't. And they probably won't. And it's the same problem that, but we do know this, that people who lived on Long Island for 40 or more years have 4 times as much breast cancer compared to people who only lived there 5 years. And if you were there during your young childhood years, in the summer, then do you remember the DDT spraying trucks, or are you too young for that? Right. Where? Which town? Point. Yeah. Right. They sprayed a number of different things, but they also had this great idea that there was potato farms on Long Island, and unfortunately the groundwater was at the level of the soil. And when they used too much pesticides for the potatoes to grow, they sold the land for housing. So they've got some very serious problems there. And it is certainly plausible that that could be one of your risk factors. The dilemma for the work we do is this. The studies I'm reporting to you on involve huge numbers of people studied over time and space. You're an N of 1. And the difficulty is we rarely can say in an individual case what that individual's cancer is due to. But certainly it is a factor, it is certainly relevant. And the thing I would say to you is the good news out of this is the work on the nutritional factors that can in fact even prevent your recurrence. So I would encourage you to do that, and I thank you for talking about it here, because I think it's often easy to forget that these statistics really are human beings with the tears removed. And it all comes down to what happens to people's lives on a daily basis. Thanks for talking about it. Yes.
There was an activist that's working on this issue. One of the problems I always run into with talking to people is that people really believe that their government is out there protecting them. And when you bring this message out, I often get, well, pesticides are on the market, must be safe, they've been approved by the EPA. One of the issues that we're working on right now are PVC toys and children, and phthalates and lead and cadmium that are in these toys that these kids are being exposed to. And what I get from agencies is, well, the Consumer Protection, Consumer Products Safety Commission hasn't taken a stand on this, so therefore everything must be okay, even though Europe has banned this stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the role between government policy?
Let's have the lights up a little bit too. Yeah, it's a challenge nowadays. I mean, remember that we have a Democratic president who is the most conservative president that we've had in years on some of these issues. And yet at the same time, I guess I'm tempted to be a little biblical here. Many of you may recall that the passage describing Noah, who was recently read in our synagogue, Noah is described as a man who was righteous in his age. And the question is, what does it mean in his age? Was he old enough to be righteous, or was he righteous relative to everybody else around him that was pretty depraved? And the general discussion was, well, everybody else is pretty depraved, and they picked him because he was like the best we could get. And I think unfortunately, when it comes to this president on the environment, he may be the best we can get, and he is relatively righteous in his age on these issues. Keep in mind that although it is appalling that we can sit here and talk about the fact that the Europeans have banned these materials in children's toys. They have banned them, right? The United States is involved in discussions with the World Trade Organization, and very high-level discussions about international trade and implications on what this means for trade and whether we should take this same action. And it's been really a challenge for all of us who care about this issue and who have tried to work with this administration. So while I am disappointed, I think that if groups like yours can come together, then to give you another biblical metaphor, Moses realized that the only way to get out of the desert is for people to band together and work together to get out of that desert. And I think that we have to do a better job when it comes to these issues of working together at the grassroots level with our partners in the private sector who want to work with us. And let me tell you, what I think we need to do on this issue is find the people who produce the alternatives to PVC and children's toys, and they exist already, and work with them on this issue. Because I'm not opposed to business, I just like it to be healthier and less polluting. And I think that those are the things that we have to do now to change these kinds of policies, which I share your view of.
This goes back to what you were saying in terms of statistics and hotspots, and I understand how you answered that question, and that makes no sense to me. My dad had worked for the FDA for a couple decades, and he just revealed to me, and I use the word revealed, that last year when he had a hernia operation, he asked the doctor to save a piece of fat. And he took it back to his lab and measured it for pesticide levels.
So I feel like, you know, if a 65-year-old veteran FDA worker is worried about pesticide levels in his staff, I wonder about myself, you know, if I were to get breast cancer, would I want them to test the fat? You know, and what you're saying is, it makes sense, but I think that's getting out there in our lay public,
Yeah.
worrying about those levels. So I wondered if you could comment more about that.
Well, I think individuals, this is where the government has a job to do and the private sector has a job to do. Individuals should not be in the business of testing their own fat residues. There ought to be a way in the health system to provide for this kind of feedback where it's relevant. But your father's testing, well, that's interesting. I assume he's a chemist?
Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean,
Yeah, I knew what he was doing, so.
or no, I don't doubt it for a second.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, and I think it's important, it's of interest. But really, it's like people carrying around designer water bottles. I mean, that is not the solution to the problem of contaminants in water. That's the solution for rich people. But the fact of the matter is, and that's not even much of a solution, because 50% of our exposure to contaminants in water comes from bathing, cooking, and showering. So if you're really concerned about contaminants in water, or you're concerned about contaminants in fat, you've got to work with your legislators at the state and local and national level to see that policies are adapted that reduce everybody's exposure. And that's the only solution. You can say no to cigarettes and you can say no to dangerous sex, but you can't say no to water and air and a belching power plant. That's the job of the government. And the only way the government is going to do its job of that sort is when citizens such as you work to become better informed and to work with those in government who have an opportunity to do the right thing. If we don't inform them, if we don't make ourselves informed, then we are really negating our responsibility in a civil society that is, after all, democracy. Democracy rests on an informed public. It's complicated to get informed about all of this alphabet soup of chemicals and things, but we have to do a better job of becoming informed, and that's what my colleagues at World Resources Institute and I are working on, and then using that information to really vote. And by the way, there is an election coming up, and I simply want to encourage all of you to get out there, not only to vote, but to encourage others who may be too disgusted with politics. I mean, we're all disgusted. We have to, the only way it's going to change is if people get involved and stay active and use the abilities that we have in our democracy. Yes?
As a democratic government, we have a lot of agencies that are not elected. How do you see a changing environment among NCI and FDA as far as being more proactive around environmental issues?
You know, I'm an optimist, or I couldn't live in Washington. So I'd like to be able to say yes, but I want to give you a slightly different answer. How many of you are aware that there was a march on Washington of cancer survivors? All right? Were any of you there? I was there, and it was really heartrending, as you might imagine. It was an appallingly hot, horrible day, and people with really moving stories. But I was personally really disappointed because it seemed such a patent exploitation of people who are already really at the edge of life. Because the lobbying was for research, money, as though all we need is money, and that's going to solve the problems. And that is not going to solve the problem of cancer or many other diseases right now. And I think the only way that NCI and FDA, and I've been an advisor to them, but I can tell you, we need you to come to bang on the door over and over and over again. You know how you get a donkey's attention? You take a 2x4 and you hit it on the head. And then it won't move, so you take a 2x4 and you hit it again. And after the 5th time, it moves. Well, our federal institutions are a little bit like those donkeys. And they need to be addressed over and over again with coherent messages. And I think you will get a positive response when those messages keep coming up. The environment really is the stepchild in this whole issue. And the Cancer Institute's job is to treat cancer and to screen for cancer. Prevention while they use the rhetoric of prevention, has never been a major focus of the National Cancer Institute. And prevention is too important a job to expect one agency to take it on. Prevention of cancer requires changing the very nature of the way the Department of Defense procures materials, the way the Department of Education trains teachers and students, the way the Department of Labor provides for worker safety and training, the way that EPA and CPSC and all the other alphabet soups work to try to protect the public. That is what is involved for cancer prevention, so it can't be done by NCI alone. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned phytochemicals in the cancer prevention. Can you tell us more about it?
Well, there are studies, many of them done in Europe, on the use of phytochemicals, phyto meaning plant, chemicals such as those in soy products and flax, and I'm sure I'll be leaving out some people's special products here, fish oil, garlic, broccoli. Many of these things kind of function like Pac-Man to gobble up bad things in the body. Many of them work literally to neutralize those. Some of them are metabolized through the liver, so they are excreted that way. Some are excreted through the feces. Many of these natural products have been studied. Again, the cell culture studies I showed you, there's a cell culture study my colleagues and I have done in Strang, where we took breast cancer cells and we added broccoli and we added a carcinogen. And we basically got the cells to stop growing. Now that's in a cell culture dish. Shark cartilage works in a cell culture dish too, but doesn't appear to work in people. So one has to be careful about these studies. But there are a number of studies on these natural products that have been very successful, and right now, they're so successful that NCI is testing them. Yeah.
And also you mentioned the cell communication, and what does it take for a cell to have communication?
Okay, well, I think we can talk perhaps more after, I guess we'll have a little bit of a break. We've written something about this in the monograph that's available from the Environmental Health Sciences Institute. When a cell is mutated, there are several processes in growth of the cell where there can be repair of that mutation. There can be deletion, there can be insertion, there can be suppression, or there can be cell death. And any of these processes, apoptosis or repair, can result in a prevention of a cancer from growing. But what we believe is that there are a number of environmental chemicals that interfere with these processes of repair, and that may be one of the mechanisms that leads to cancer. But let me be clear about this. Breast cancer is due at least to two different mechanisms, either one of which can be relevant. Under some circumstances, it can work through hormonal receptors without anything directly going into genes, just revving up those hormones. Under other circumstances, like with atrazine, it may work by directly damaging the DNA structure or the function of DNA, the ability of DNA to fix itself. So either one of those can be relevant to the disease. If you want more information, again, some of that's on our website as well.
Because I would like to know about the glyconuclease, the 8 essential glyconuclease.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you're pretty well informed, and let me put you two in touch, and we can talk about it afterwards. Yes.
But you do say a lot about mammograms, and I wondered if there are any research of studies that it seems to me that to compress the breast so extremely every year.
Yeah. Right, and just think of who invented that, right? Where did you get the idea for this one? Oh, Charlie, check this one out, right? Right, okay. First of all, the self-exam of the breast has been oversold, as has mammography, but I still believe we should try to do these things because we don't have anything better on the horizon, right? But for goodness sake, people shouldn't feel guilty if they don't, quote, find their cancers. And I really want to urge you, though, to go back there and check out those forms just because they're here now, and you rarely do get a chance to see what a tumor should feel like underneath the breast. But with respect to mammography, there is clear evidence that mammography will save lives in women after menopause who have regular mammography and regular clinical breast exams. both together. My only recommendation, which differs somewhat from that of the Cancer Institute, which is, some of you may know, got forced to change its recommendations, is that there should be regular mammograms for women in menopause every 18 months or so. And the period of it should be determined by the woman consulting with her health professional. Mammography, however, and clinical breast exam are not prevention. Prevention would mean having a blood or urine test that would predict who's at risk of developing breast cancer, so that early on we can give them the right combination of nutraceuticals, and of course the environment would be cleaner in the first place, to reduce their chance of actually developing the disease. That's what we really need, and that's what I'm working on with my colleagues at Cornell Medical Center right now, are some blood and urine tests that could be used to predict who's at risk of getting the disease and intervene before the disease develops. Yes?
What about mammography in young women with risk factors?
Okay. There is a big controversy over this. Young women at risk of breast cancer may be more susceptible to the risks associated with radiation and breast cancer. So it's a double whammy, right? I generally think that screening mammography, which means taking women with no symptoms and giving them mammography, should only be done on women after menopause. But any woman at any age that has a symptom, for example, this young woman here, who clearly had a symptom, whether when you were nursing that you detected it or during pregnancy, then that requires an examination and certainly a follow-up with mammography. If you ask me, there are new technologies that are being developed, but I'm very concerned about something here, and that's, let me put on my other hat. At World Resources Institute, we work on world health, and I'm working with people in China and Mexico and Brazil and India. They don't have mammograms, and they're not going to get them. And what we have to do in those situations really is come up with primary prevention, because mammography will, in those countries, will only be available to the very rich, and it won't work for the most part, because we sell them our 30-year-old machines. We do. We do. So we've got to be smarter at developing tests that are blood and urine tests here that will predict risk, rather than coming up with the things that are simply going to confirm disease markers already happened.
When you're talking about blood tests, there's a test that you can do to see if you have
Yeah, that's a blood test. Well, there actually are several breast cancer genes.
And I don't understand why they're not more available. And it's, I would like to, one of these days, have that test done, but I'm scared to with insurance and the availability of it.
There are a lot of issues with respect to genetic testing, a lot. And if you, maybe we can talk about this afterwards. If you have, do you have a mother or sister with breast cancer?
Mother,
And
she got it about
so you may want to talk to people for genetic counseling and deciding what to do. But there's recent federal legislation which was passed saying that there cannot be discrimination against people based on genetic testing. But you need to check on that and find out. Every state is different, and of course, because we do not have national health insurance, it's really a very difficult set of issues. But you may well want to pursue that and do it in the context of the confidentiality that you can get with a health provider. But every state has different rules right now, and I know that there's federal legislation that is pending on this issue. Yeah.
Is there a greater risk for, that you've ever experienced in your studies, of a girl developing breast cancer because her mother had cancer while she was pregnant?
I don't think so, and I don't know. I haven't seen that. What kind of cancer?
It was the news just now.
And I just don't know. I mean, I'm sorry that I don't know. Yeah. And you were ER negative. Right, because you're not, ER negative is usually for younger women. And so therefore, I would think not. All right? I think it would depend on the estrogen receptor status. Is there anyone else here with a medical background who knows about this? It's just something I'm not really that about.
I don't know anything about the question, the alpha-fetal protein question. I'm aware of that. I was just reading something that younger women Now, your question, I guess, comes from infants. So younger women who are pregnant are protected by this 13, which is also known to protect the birth defects.
Yeah. It's a very complicated set of issues. What I would say is that the gene work has been oversold, but there are some people at high risk, and people who have breast cancer in their 30s and with a family history of it are at high risk. And yet it's important to realize that even those with the gene, not 100% of them go on to develop breast impairing. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And again, I think the advice that you would want to get would be to work with someone that you're comfortable with on a regular basis to make these decisions. I don't, because I think that it's not been well studied and tested, and it's the dilemma that we have as well. There is a very big complex of institutions involved in medical research in this country. And for example, in this country, we are recommending tamoxifen as a, quote, preventive for breast cancer. And in Europe, they would never think of such a thing. In this country, we had the industry that manufactures tamoxifen spend almost $100 million to support a trial conducted by the National Cancer Institute to see whether it made sense to give this drug to a lot of people. And I had seen almost no public discussion about the conflict of interest implicit in that. So we've got a lot of issues that need to be addressed here. And hopefully, with the kinds of groups that we've put together here and the questions that you're asking, we'll be able to make some progress on those fronts. Right?
I'd also like to extend an invitation to all of you who are interested in joining Women's Voices. These are the very issues that we are working on. We're trying to reduce the manufacture and incineration of PVC plastic, the use of pesticides, promoting alternatives, the use of chlorinated compounds in every way, shape, and form. But we need your voices. So please join us. You all signed up. We'll be sending you some video.
I have worked on a documentary film with Olivia Newton-John on breast cancer and the environment, and Holly is working with Senator Bacchus's office. You might want to talk with her, and we're going to figure out how to air it on Montana PBS and arrange for a panel discussion afterwards with call-ins with an 800 number with a doctor and some of the activists and private sector community, so that we can continue this discussion about the things that can be done. I want to be clear, we don't know all that we need to know about this issue. But I think we know enough to take precautionary action, and that will only come about when people become better informed about what the options are.